The haunting tales of dark Shivering. Visiting dark Shivering every week back in the 1980s on business meant that I came to know its history and people quite well. For every house, building and street there was a ghostly tale to tell. Here are just a few of them to enjoy. The Dogman. Every village and town has its unusual residents. They're known for maybe their odd behavior or beliefs, and dark Shivering was no different. One of their unusual villages was a man called Charlie. Charlie lived on a rather large property, consisting of a farmhouse, with outbuildings, barns, and covered over 200 acres of land. He used the land for various purposes, from farming and crops, to storing people's caravans. It was the latter use that I happened upon in the winter of 1985. Whilst staying at the dark Shivering Inn, I had met Charlie many times in the bar in the evening, and chatted away happily for hours. This particular time, however, I had made a mistake with my booking, and neglected to increase my night's stay, when another work meeting cropped up on that particular trip. Luck was on my side that evening, however, as Charlie was sat in the bar and offered me to stay the night in one of the many empty caravans on his property. I couldn't have been any more grateful, and offered to pay for the inconvenience. It was saving me over 100 miles round trip to have to come back the next day for a meeting. Charlie insisted it was no problem and warmly invited me to follow him in my car to his house. It wasn't too far to get to Charlie's property. The lane that led up to his house was more of a gravel track with plenty of potholes and puddles to try and avoid. But we made it there in about 20 minutes. Just before a huge rain and thunderstorm broke out overhead, we both dashed to the front door, and even in those few seconds we were both drenched and glad to get inside. Once we went in, two dogs came to welcome us. I could see they had been sat by a warm oven in the kitchen, as both dog beds were pushed up close to it. We sat in the warm kitchen drying off and drinking a hot drink. I could see that the house looked very run down, and Charlie probably lived mainly in the kitchen. He told me himself that the bedrooms upstairs were not lived in. It had been his parents' property before his, and the bedrooms were full of a mixture of old antiques and rubbish. Sorting him out was on his to-do list, but I had a feeling the list might have been lost in one of the bedrooms, never to be seen again. As we chatted, both of his dogs jumped up and became restless. They both came and sat by Charlie's legs and insisted on being petted by him. I asked if they were okay, and he chuckled and said they'd probably heard the dogman outside. When Charlie first said this, I thought he was joking and so laughed. He went on to state matter-of-factly that there was a story about a dogman roaming his property back when he was a child in the 1930s. It was all I could do to not spit my drink out in shock, as I realized that I was going to be spending the night in a paper-thin caravan, in the middle of a stormy night on a dogman property. Charlie could see the obvious concern on my face, and attempted to ease my fears by waving his hands and saying it was probably just a dog that was feral and scaring people. As grateful as I was of his attempt to backtrack on what he'd told me, I had to state the obvious and tell him that even feral dogs run on 4 legs. Only dogmen and werewolves walk on 2. I told him if I was to be staying the night, I'd rather know what had happened in the area rather than be caught unawares. He looked a bit uncomfortable at this request, but awkwardly went on to tell me what he'd heard and experienced over the years. He said that back when he was a child he had a vague memory of being outside late at night with his parents. It was late summer and they had been working all day. They'd been so busy chatting and enjoying the evening that they hadn't realized how dark and cold it had gone. So they began packing up their chairs and carrying in their plates and cups. Charlie was busy trying to balance the crockery when a commotion began around him. It all happened so fast, but he could hear his mother panicking and his dad shouting to get in the house. Before he had time to react to what was happening around him, his mother crashed into him from behind and grabbed him, pushing him inside the front door. His mother and father were shouting and scrambling around to close windows and doors. Charlie was afraid but too young to understand what was going on. In his child's mind, he thought a grizzly bear was trying to get in the house. He remembers that once the house was secure, his mother took him up to bed and made him sleep in with her whilst his father seemingly stayed up all night. As kids do, he soon forgot about the ordeal and just assumed it was an animal of some sort that had gotten loose and his mum and dad didn't want it getting in the house. After that night, though, it became common practice to be inside the house by darkfall. It was a few years later, when he was a teenager, that Charlie overheard a conversation between his father and a neighbor that brought back memories of that unusual night when he was a child. The two men didn't know Charlie was listening in on their conversation, but they were stood outside of the barn he was in, and so he couldn't help but overhear most of what was said. The neighbor was telling his father that all of his sheep had been slaughtered the night before. He was asking Charlie's father if he had had any such attack on his farm. But Charlie's father told the neighbor that he hadn't kept any livestock on his farm for years due to some similar and sinister situations going on. The neighbor seemed unsure as to what he meant, and so proceeded to ask if he meant a purposeful attack by another person. But Charlie's father's answer didn't just shock the neighbor, it shocked Charlie too. He told the neighbor in earnest that he refused to keep any more animals on the farm because a large creature that looked to be half man and half dog kept coming on the property and killing them. The dogman had also taken to coming close to the house, and so he had sold all his remaining animals. Since doing that, he hadn't seen the dogman on his property for years. The neighbor was understandably shocked and seemed to leave with an understanding that maybe a wolf was on the loose. But that was not what Charlie's dad had described at all. The idea of a dogman seemed a bit far-fetched to me and reminded me of the old black and white werewolf movies. I wondered if this is why the villagers thought of Charlie as a bit unusual. Maybe he had told them of this dogman, and they thought he was mad. Although I was unbelieving of a dogman at this point, I was still interested in his story and quite happily let him continue. He said that if he ever brought up the subject of that frightening night when he was a child, his parents would both dismiss it as nothing important. He thought they didn't want him to be afraid to live there. His mother and father had died a good 20 years ago, back in the 1960s. It was on his mother's deathbed that she spoke of this creature for the first time with Charlie. She told him that all those years ago they had been stalked by a dogman-type creature. They had seen it often when they had animals. It hid in the shadows watching the farm. Sometimes in the middle of the night they heard it circling their farmhouse. Charlie's dad would look out the windows and watch as this dogman glided effortlessly around the building, making grunting and deathly noises. They never saw it again after all the farm animals were gone. But sometimes they would hear noises coming from the barn in the middle of the night, as if it was searching for its next victim. Charlie said that he had never seen any dogman creature in his lifetime living on the farm. But also he had never kept animals there either, only his dogs for company. It was getting late now and the rain had subsided slightly, so I could make a dash for the caravan Charlie had promised me. I told him to stay inside the house in the warm and that I'd find my way easily enough. He'd given me directions and said it was the first caravan on the left. I could see quite easily where I was going. The lights from the farmhouse lit up far enough that I could walk confidently without losing my way. As I walked towards the left-hand side, I could see that there was a row of 6 caravans to my right. On the left side, however, the caravans were all stored within the barns. This at least gave me shelter from the rain and wind whilst I fumbled with the door. I managed to get inside and make myself comfortable, and it was coming up to midnight when I got myself in bed. As I lay by the window, I looked out towards the farmhouse and could see that Charlie had switched all the lights off and was probably asleep in the warm with his dogs. It seemed a little creepier outside now without the welcoming glow of the house lights, but I managed to roll over and fall asleep. I had been asleep for over an hour and it was coming up to 2 a.m. in the morning when I was terrified to be awoken by loud banging noises outside the caravan. I was half asleep and couldn't quite process where I was or what was happening. It took me a few seconds to remember where I was. I felt annoyed and thought maybe Charlie was up early banging about working inside the barn. But I checked my watch and could see it was only 1:45 a.m. I looked out through my window and could see the house was still in darkness, but the banging from the back of the barn continued on. My mind was racing, wondering what could be making the noise. Was it a wild boar rooting about for food? Was it a burglar trying to steal a caravan? Was it a caravan owner wanting to get his caravan? I just didn't know, and so as I sat there thinking about it, the noises suddenly stopped. After sitting there a while in silence just waiting to hear a pin drop, I decided to go and see what it was that had made all the noise. In my head I was pretty much set on it being a wild boar. But my blood ran cold as I got to the door. I was just about to open it and go outside when a massive creature walked past the window. It looked like a monster. It had to be over 7 foot tall because I couldn't see its head. I could just see a huge chest covered in fur. I wanted to dive under my bed covers, but I was frozen to the spot. I must have been stuck there with my eyes running for what seemed like forever. But as I gained some movement back in my body, I leaned forward to look out of the door window again. There was nothing there. I could see the caravan next to mine when suddenly a face rose up from underneath the window. My eyes were fixated on the face of a dogman, and as the horror built up inside me, it opened its mouth and snarled. That was obviously too much for me. I must have passed out in sheer terror. The next thing I remember, it was daylight. I was lay awkwardly between the units on the hard floor and the steps to the door. I was unsure of what had happened at first. I thought maybe it was a dream. I decided to get up and leave even though it was before 6 a.m. in the morning. The farmhouse was in silence, and so I pushed an envelope through Charlie's letterbox. It had some money in and a note saying I'd see Charlie the next time I was in dark Shivering. I decided to head back over to the dark Shivering Inn, as I could sit and have some breakfast there even at that early hour. As was usual, I chatted away to the waitress whilst she brought out cereals and pastries. I told her about forgetting to book my room with them the night before, and she laughed and said that she'd heard I had gone to stay at Charlie's farm. She said the staff had spoken about it the previous evening and wondered if they'd ever see me again. I laughed and assured her that although Charlie was a bit unusual, he wasn't a mass murderer or anything. But she looked at me and said she didn't know if he was a murderer or not, but 2 other people had gone to stay at Charlie's farm in the last few years, and both of them were missing. A shiver went up my spine. I finished my coffee, and for the first time ever was glad to be leaving dark Shivering. The Black-Eyed Boy of Dark Shivering. This is one of those stories that somebody's friend's auntie's sister told somebody else, if you know what I mean. Everyone in dark Shivering knows the tale, and everyone knows someone who has come into contact with the Black-Eyed Boy. They call him a boy, but depending on who is telling the story, his age varies from between 14 to 18 years old. The first person to mention the boy to me was Mary Lynch. Mary lives with her husband Keith at the Old Dairy, which was once a large working dairy farm. Now, the dairy is more of a small holding, as Mary and Keith are both in their late 50s, and so a smaller concern suits them better. Mary is a relentless chatterbox and always has time to speak to anyone, man or beast. Many times I've passed her walking her dog down the lane and she has been in full conversation with him. I called into the dairy every time I was in dark Shivering to buy fresh eggs, each time thinking it was only a 10-minute job. I would inevitably be over an hour when Mary got into full swing. Her story is best told in her own words, I feel, as no one can convey Mary's story quite like Mary.
It was last Friday that I met that boy with the black eyes. Nasty-looking boy he was. It was probably about 3:30 that I was taking Bert for his walk, It had been a cold, rainy day anyway, and it was already beginning to get dark. I was walking along the tree line that outlined the bottom field. I wasn't hanging about as it was cold and the sky looked like it was going to pour with rain any second. I looked all around and there was nobody about. The only movement was the smoke coming from the chimney as I had set a fire just before our walk. Bert ran on ahead and cut across the field back to the farm. I carried on around the footpath as I didn't want to walk through a rabbit hole-infested field and do myself a mischief. Suddenly, as if lightning was ready to strike me down, the hair all over my body stood up on end and I could feel the electricity in the air. I hurried up as I actually thought it was going to thunder and lightning when out of nowhere I was stood face to face with a young lad. He scared me half to death and I must have jumped a mile in the air. However, he did not react at all, which in itself was strange. Now I will talk to anyone, as you know, but this boy felt dangerous. I felt that I needed to get home as quickly as possible, so I didn't say a word to him. I just sped off straight through the middle of the field, which I hadn't wanted to do. I rushed through the tufts of grass, eager to get to my house. I didn't like the look of that boy at all. He had a sinister quality to him. At this point I couldn't tell you what he looked like as I was too keen to get away. Finally I got to my side door, hauled it open, and me and Bert went inside. I was so frightened by this boy, even though he hadn't done anything to me, that I rushed to lock all of the doors and made sure the windows were all shut too. I called my husband on his mobile to tell him what had happened, and he told me to keep the doors locked and that he was on his way home. I started to feel relieved that Keith would be home shortly, and I was glad Bert was there for company. After a minute or two though, Bert went and stood at the door and started to growl quietly. His fur all down his back stood up like a Mohican. At this point I was really beginning to worry. I started to feel like I was in some bad horror movie. I didn't want to look to see if he was outside the door, but I would rather know where he was than to be caught unaware. I pulled the curtain away from the side window slightly, fully expecting this boy to be stood outside my kitchen door. I don't even think I was breathing. I was so scared, but I could see the porch area and thankfully no one was there. I started to breathe again and turned around to soothe poor Bert. As I turned I looked down the hallway towards the entrance hall, and there this boy was, large as life, stood outside my front door. The door that I had only just locked was now wide open with a stranger stood in its frame. I let out a cry, but the boy didn't move. He didn't even attempt to come inside the house, so I mustered up some courage and rushed towards him. "What do you want?" I asked. "Excuse me, would it be okay to come in and use your phone, please?" His reply was so unnatural in sound and tone I wanted to cry. His words were long, deep and dragged out as though someone had turned the speed down on a record player. I was almost frozen with fear. The hallway was in darkness and the only thing I could do was fumble for the switch. When I clicked the light on and everything became illuminated, I stared at this stranger and he stared back with big black glossy eyes. No whites, no iris, no definable pupil, just deep black holes. I slammed the door shut in his face. He didn't try to gain access, but he kept talking in that horrible slow voice. It sounded like he was melting. "Excuse me. Would it be okay to come in and use your phone, please? Excuse me. Would it be okay to come in and use your phone, please? Excuse me. Would it be okay to come in and use your phone, please?" At this point I'm just about to grab the phone and call the police when I see my husband's vehicle approaching the courtyard. Thank God, I'm saved was all I could think. Keith hurried to the house and I stood in the hallway waiting. When he came in, the boy was no longer outside, and Keith said that he couldn't see anyone at the house when he arrived. Now, my story sounds totally unbelievable, totally made up. If someone told me this story I would think they were pulling my leg. I didn't think there would be a soul in this village who would believe me, but I have proof. Even Keith can't explain what happened. On the flagstone floor outside both the kitchen door and the main door are a set of footprints, both exactly the same, scorched into the stone, just where the boy was standing. They appeared after my horrible experience and I've tried to clean them off with all sorts of stuff, but nothing will remove them. They are there for everyone to see, and most of the village has been by to have a look. I won't be walking Bert on my own again. I don't feel safe like I used to, and it's not because some strange boy visited me that day, it's because that boy was not any kind of human that has ever walked this earth. It was like being stood in front of a monster, except you couldn't see this monster, it was hiding.
I have to say, Mary's story gave me the utter creeps, especially as she told me whilst in her kitchen, where the incident happened. I can honestly say, as God is my witness, she does indeed have a black set of footprints outside both doors. Since she told me her story, I've always felt quite apprehensive about being on her property. It feels spooky even in the summer. Having said that, if you listen to all the black-eyed boy stories, the entire village is unsafe. According to the locals, you'll be safe as long as you don't invite him into your home or vehicle. What happens if you do, I'm not sure, but I don't think I'd be inclined to invite a boy into my home with a voice tempo problem or lumps of coal for eyes. Another story which actually made the local newspaper at the time was a particularly unusual incident involving the residents of Puddle Lane. It was late on a weeknight when the black-eyed boy struck. It was 1971, and there were only 8 houses on Puddle Lane back then. He paid each house a visit and asked to be let in, and one by one, they all turned him away. Doreen Dance at number 8 wouldn't even open her door after spying him through her bedroom curtains. She said he stared directly up at her with no eyes. Mrs. Moon at number 7 opened her door with the safety chain on, and before she even noticed, his eyes had given him an ear bashing for calling on her so late. Cosmo Hayes at number 6, who was a notoriously grumpy old man, shouted through his glass door, "What did the caller want?" When the boy asked if he could come in, he was told in no uncertain terms to piss off. Mindy Mack at number 5 called the police when she was sat in her lounge watching a Hammer horror film, and the black-eyed boy stood at her window with his face pushed up to the glass staring in at her. Dickie Frost at number 4 hid behind his sofa after seeing the black-eyed boy knock at everyone else's door. Rosie Turner at number 3 nearly had a fit when she opened her door to the boy. Apparently at this point he was talking Babel and punching the air with his hands, and she thought he was a ninja, like she had seen on the TV. Screaming bloody murder, she barricaded herself in. George Bishop at number 2 took one look at the boy and sent his wife to deal with him. And finally, Harry Sprite was the only neighbor on the lane with large lockable iron gates that kept the boy far enough away until the police arrived. The boy just stood rattling the gates and staring up at the house as though he was longing to get in. Other stories told about the black-eyed boy are all very similar, and after chatting to lots of local people about it, it seems that they don't disbelieve these stories because all of them know somebody's friend's auntie's sister who told somebody else the story of when they met the black-eyed boy. The Old Color Works Factory. The Color Works factory sits just behind a row of 1920s council houses. Their 50-foot gardens stretch down to its 7-foot-high wall, which runs the whole perimeter of its 5,000 square meters. The factory has been there since the late 1800s and was a paint shop up until its closure in the 1950s. It employed over 50 local men and more from surrounding areas, so its closure was felt by the families in the village as this forced them to look for work further away from home. The large site not only houses the main factory, but also many smaller buildings. Mostly single-story storage facilities. The land and buildings have been for sale since the 1950s, but as it cannot be used to build residential buildings on due to undermining, it has remained a derelict plot. The villagers of Dark Shivering have embraced the factory as part of their landscape. Its worn but still charming multicolored Color Works sign still hangs proudly above its flaking painted doors and rusted entry gates. Surprisingly, the signs have fared well over the years, and even though the colors would have been much bolder in their heyday, the now pastel lettering is still readable through the age of time. I passed the Color Works factory every time I stayed in Dark Shivering. I never knew much about it, but the factory was an impressive sight to behold. It had the look of an old-fashioned hospital about it. It had a large clock in the center of the building above the main doors, but sadly its hands were long turned to dust. It boasted a mansard roof filled with windows along its edges. It was very ornamental in its construction and betrayed in all its features that it was once a paint factory. It wasn't until I happened upon chatting to an old retired security guard who had worked at the site, that I found out the old factory had a few ghost stories of its own. We had met in the gardens of the Dark Shivering Inn. It was a lovely warm summer's evening and we were both enjoying the late sunshine with an after-dinner cognac. Ron, the security guard, shared with me the following tale. I was working for a security company back in the 1960s. They had many different sites to keep secure and the Colorworks factory was a new job for us. Our company's main source of work was old industrial sites, ones which were no longer in use, but still owned by various companies and they had value to the land. As guards we were used to working alone through the night. The buildings were empty and full of echoes, but you took it all in your stride. The Colorworks had been closed for many years at this point, but a large company from the city was using its outbuildings as a short-term storage solution. A guard was required at night from 6 p.m. and you wouldn't see anyone until 6 a.m. the next morning when the gaffer would arrive to open the storage buildings back up. It was a quiet job and there was never any trouble whilst I was there. The biggest problem for the security company was getting a guard to work there. Most only worked one night and refused to go back. I was probably one of the guards who lasted the longest. I worked 1 month exactly at the Colorworks before the company who were using it found alternative storage closer to their offices in the city. Our base for the evening shift was set up in one of the smaller buildings on the grounds. It was about 300 feet from the main building and was being hugged on all sides by brambles trailing up the walls. It was only 1 story and had just 2 small rooms, one being a toilet and the other was where we sat. There was an old desk in the corner with a fireside wing-back chair behind it. In the opposite corner was a heater which took the edge off the chill in the night. As part of our nightly duty we had to walk around the factory and site perimeter every hour, including inside the main factory. One of our gaffers would visit us once throughout the night shift to make sure everything was okay. Funnily enough, he visited the Colorworks factory before dark just after 6 p.m. each time and never stayed long to chat. I had only started on the job a few days, before the most unnerving things started to happen every night at the same time of 11:30. A dark figure of a man would walk past the office window. Now the first couple of times this happened I checked the whole area, but found nothing, and the next few times it happened I tried to get a good look at him. Each time he came past my window he would scare me as he would catch me off guard. So one night I pressed my face right up to the glass for a good look, and when I saw him I wish I hadn't. He came gliding by as usual, but this time I could see he was in a soldier's uniform. He only looked like a young man, and to my surprise and terror, as he passed the window he turned his head and stared straight at me. The only thing was, he didn't have any eyes in his sockets. Just black empty holes on a ghastly white face. Well, I fell back onto the desk and didn't move for what seemed like forever. After each visit from the soldier, the office would go bitterly cold and stayed that way for a couple of hours. At this point I knew the place was obviously haunted, but I needed the job and to be honest I didn't think anyone would believe me. From that night on I never looked at that man again and even put up some makeshift curtains lest he should come up to the window looking for me. The ghost of a soldier wasn't the only problem with the place, and to be honest, as soon as I arrived there for my very first shift I felt a weird feeling from the factory itself. I do wonder whether the apparition was really a soldier or something darker trying to purposely scare me. It felt like you were being watched from the windows as you walked around outside. Sometimes it seemed as though shadows flitted across those black empty windows. I don't know why the factory had a bad feeling to it. As far as I'm aware there were no tragic accidents and no one ever died there. The strange thing was, that one night you could walk around the whole site and feel perfectly fine. There was surprisingly little graffiti on the walls, the odd upside-down cross and pentagram here and there that teenagers had probably sprayed to amuse each other. But on other nights you had to push yourself to move through the corridors and brace yourself when you opened each internal door. Almost waiting for someone to jump out on you from the other side. Fear could literally freeze you to the spot. The factory was a large stone-built building, and on those nights when the atmosphere was bad, you could hear voices in the empty rooms. If you tried to listen to what was being said they would stop. But if you kept walking through the building there was a permanent conversation going on that you were not invited to. Sometimes you could hear footsteps following behind you, but no one was ever there. The voices and footsteps were almost as if they were trying to give you the creeps, knowing you were there alone and vulnerable. On my last night at the Color Works, my gaffer came in before dark as usual and thanked me for working there. He told me that he had difficulty in getting any of the other guards to work on that site, and if I hadn't have stayed he would have had to end the contract early. After a brief chat he left and I worked my last night. It wasn't a good night particularly. The dark figure had already walked past my window and had left my room icy cold. A chill went down my back and I thought I may as well go and do my security check. I was almost finished inside the factory when I heard what I thought sounded like an animal growling. It didn't sound like a dog, but more like a monster you would see in a scary film. It was loud and guttural and froze me to the spot with all my hairs tingling. I felt very certain at that moment that I must get out of there immediately, but I didn't want to run. I felt like whatever or whoever was in there would start chasing after me like a predator. It was like slowly backing away from a lion. I walked backwards all the way through the main reception room and bumped into the front door. As I awkwardly twisted my body to get the door open, I took my eyes off the room to look at what I was doing. And boom, as soon as I did that I felt something running towards me. I couldn't see anything, but in my head I knew there was something going to attack me. I slid through the gap in the door and slammed it hard behind me. As I shakily put the key in the lock and turned it, something banged into the door from inside. It was such an explosion of noise and power I thought the door was going to come off its hinges. I ran back over to my office and I stayed there for the rest of the night. It was still dark at 6 a.m. when other workmen arrived on site. I handed over the keys with relief and began my walk home, not before I had a last look over my shoulder, of course. And boy did I shudder as I looked at the small one-story building I'd been sat in all night, and saw a tired white face with two hollow black eyes staring back at me from the office window. The thought of him being in my office with me all night was too much for me and I legged it home. After Ron shared his story with me, I took it upon myself to do a little digging into the history of the site to see if there were any occurrences that could account for the ghostly goings-on. I spoke to Homer Powell, who is a local historian, and he told me that dark Shivering had lost its fair share of young men in both wars, and so seeing the ghost of a soldier may not be particularly out of place. More interestingly though, one young man by the name of Herbie Jones died a particularly nasty death when he was caught up under a German tank. His body was turned to pulp, forcing his eyes to pop out of their sockets as the tank rolled over his poor lifeless body. His fellow comrades never found his eyes and he was returned home to dark Shivering without them. He was buried up in what is now known as Devil's Church graveyard alongside a few other fallen men. It would seem by the sad figure that Ron saw most nights at the Color Works factory that maybe Herbie Jones cannot rest to this day, wandering the night searching for his eyes. I have no idea why he would choose the Color Works factory. Maybe locals used to walk through there as a shortcut. All I do know is that I have a very reliable witness who saw him on many occasions, in fact too many for his own liking. Devil's Church. Devil's Church is what the local children of dark Shivering call the ruins of an old church nestled at the end of a woodland track. It was a fully functioning church up until the 1980s when a scandal rocked the village. Due to its isolated location, it has always attracted youngsters and vandals, but in the 1980s it had its own congregation of devil worshippers. When the clergy found out that an unscrupulous group of people had been using the church out of hours, between midnight and 4 a.m. for their own brand of worshipping, all hell broke loose, so to speak. The church was mysteriously burnt to the ground and no one could decide if the clergy had done it or the devil worshippers. In any case, the local people had a new chapel built in the center of the village and it was rumored that the devil worshippers found themselves a new place of worship too. Locals still like to debate where this could be, but nothing has ever come to light. Walking through the woods by the old church, it's not uncommon to find many unusual objects hanging from the old oak trees. A lock of hair here, a piece of jewelry there, Even today, many trees still bear the scars of occult symbols, and the ones closest to the church were scorched by the inhuman heat of the fire. They stand blackened around the ruins like matchsticks in the ashtray. After the scandal had blown over, Devil's Church once again became the place for children to congregate away from their parents' disapproving eyes. For teenagers to meet up at night and frighten one another, and for young sweethearts to squeeze a little closer on cold autumn nights. Late one evening on one of my frequent stays at the dark Shivering Inn, the duty manager, a welcoming ruddy-faced chap and one of the locals, struck up a conversation with me about Devil's Church. Me being the only resident of the inn that night, we all sat together in the lounge room and chatted away freely whilst sinking into two large old leather sofas. The standard lamps in the room gave off a warm glow as we chatted. The curtains were still wide open and outside was wet and windy, so windy the wooden window frames knocked against each other in a rhythmic beat. As it turned out that night, the duty manager, Godfrey Parks, had a magnificent tale for us. To this day I still ask him if it was true, and every time he swears as God is his witness, there had never been a truer tale told. His story began with his grandfather, John Buffon. For most of his life he had been a loving and caring man who was well respected within the community. That was until one of his children was killed in a freak motorcycle accident. His firstborn son was the apple of his father's eye, and when he was killed after being decapitated by a speeding lorry, his father turned into a depressive and violent drunk who became estranged from his wife. Heartbroken and soul destroyed, he had buried his son at the small churchyard of Devil's Church. There were many whispers amongst the locals that poor old John would never get over the loss of his son. It had turned him into a bitter man who nobody recognized anymore. Over the years the local whispers grew in pace that he became mixed up with the occult. He became very reclusive, and only those who still knew John said he spent the rest of his life sadly trying to communicate with his dead son. He was in so much pain at the loss of his boy, his only boy, that he turned his back on religion and God. His heart turned to stone and his soul was nowhere to be seen. The people of the village thought he had gone quite mad when he spoke of the weird rituals he had performed. He told some folk about the conversations he had held with his son, who had now in his mind returned to him. The locals thought he was a man to be pitied, and so avoided him at all costs. John Buffon eventually died a happy man, reunited he felt with his son that he'd mourned over so deeply. The locals felt more at ease with him gone too, or so they thought. After his death, his family took a long time to sort through his house and his possessions, not because there was so much to do, but rather because they had come across some very unusual material. Whilst sorting through his personal files in his study, they happened upon a very old and ornate wooden box that they found was full of folders with occult teachings in them. They sat in his study surrounded by boxes of paperwork and slowly began to read through the old text. It turned out that John had indeed been performing some of the rituals they found in the box. He had written many notes in the side margins of where, when and what he practiced. They even found written evidence that he had performed some dark magic at Devil's Church, and found many notes and diary entries made afterwards to support the events. The family took everything from John's study and immediately burnt it on a huge fire at the bottom of the garden. The black smoke could be seen for miles around, and the ashes of his work gently fell back down to the ground, covering the village in a snowy ash that blew around for days. The family were so afraid and ashamed of what he had done, and decided never to speak of what happened again. But when in the 1980s the devil-worshipping scandal broke, John's widow was in such a state that she told Godfrey Parks, who happened to be her grandson, the whole sordid story. John Buffon had been studying everything on the occult he could get his hands on. He firmly believed that he could bring his son back to life with the correct incantations. He would slip out of his house into the darkness of the night and make his way to the church each night. Then he would set about the devil's work. Gradually he turned the churchyard soil sour and then bided his time until his death. It was always understood that he would be buried alongside his son, and this was duly done. When his family had found all his studies after his death, They showed in perfect scripture that when God's church fell with blasphemous flames, he and his son would walk the earth once more, bound by unholy fire. When the family had first read these words, they were appalled by his depraved meddling. But when the church actually did burn down in the 1980s, they knew his words had been prophetic and were terrified of the consequences. After this deeply disturbing story, I must say I found myself more than a little on edge. The lounge room that had felt warm and cozy when we first sat down was by now much more ominous. As we came to the end of our evening, Godfrey was getting ready to lock up the inn, and the only other customer was on his way home. I watched as the bolt slid across the door and the final customer walked past the large bay windows, pulling his coat up around his neck to stop the cold wind from chilling him. I cautiously made my way down the creaky corridor by myself and listened to the wind howling around the window frames. The next morning, as I sat eating breakfast, the waitress, who I knew very well at this point, came in and helped herself to a glass of juice. We exchanged pleasantries, and I told her about the strange story I had been told the night before. Much to my surprise, she had her own snippet of information to add to the story, so I invited her to tell me all the details. There was no one else in the dining room, but she spoke in hushed tones as if she didn't want the walls to hear what she was saying. She proceeded to tell me that when she and her boyfriend were younger, they used to go to Devil's Church to be alone together. One Friday night in September, they had been up there for a couple of hours, sitting with their backs up against the churchyard wall, chatting and laughing, when suddenly her boyfriend let out a cry and shot off like a speeding bullet, screaming at her to follow him and hurry up. She laughed as she told me that usually nothing scared him, as he was a stocky, tall chap. As she got up to start running after him, she realized she had never seen anyone move quite so fast, and at one point he was so far ahead of her she couldn't even see him. When she finally caught up to him in the middle of the village, no less, she breathlessly asked him what the big idea was, running off and leaving her like that. But he was in such a state he couldn't talk. She had to take him home and calm him down. When they got to the front door, his mum came into the hallway and let out a gasp. A large chunk of his usually dark hair had turned bright white. They had been home a while, and his mother had managed to calm him down enough so he could speak again. She had poured a trickle of whiskey in a glass and told him it would help with the shock. Whilst taking tiny sips of the burning liquid, he told them that he had seen two corpse-like figures walking towards them from her side of the path. They were shuffling out of the darkness, and that one of the figures didn't seem to have a head on its shoulders. She chuckled as she told me it's a good job she didn't see the terrifying duo, as she would have got back to the village a lot quicker than her boyfriend did. Apparently his hair still has a white patch in it today. After leaving the inn to attend a meeting, I didn't give this story any thought for the rest of the day, as I was particularly busy with work. But as I returned to the inn at gone 3 p.m., the waitress and her boyfriend were just leaving the car park, and I could see as he drove off that he did indeed have a white streak in the front of his hair. Join me next time for more haunting tales of dark shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to hear more creepy content and never miss an episode.